everybody, and welcome to JTV. Today we're joined by a guest from across the pond. We're based in London. This guest is based in America, DC to be specific, who is coming out with a new book which looked really fascinating, and it's called Woke Antisemitism: How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. And it's written by our guest who joins us here today, David Bernstein. And I'll tell you a bit about David, but what's really interesting about David is that he is a Jew that's very much involved in progressive politics in America and has been for a while. And as we were just speaking off air just before we began this, he was just saying how he's found in recent years, because of what he just characterizes as the woke sort of movement and ideas, he said it's made things, it's in some ways has made things much more challenging in terms of advocating for Jewish issues, and there's all kinds of blind spots and problems when it comes to anti-Semitism that is in many ways surprising, given that the whole purpose, the self-described purpose of all this woke content and progressivism generally is about trying to give voice and support to minority groups. So there's a real contradiction there, which I think is really fascinating to discuss. But just a bit of background to David. As I said, been very involved in Jewish advocacy, Israel advocacy, American progressive politics for a long time. He's the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, the JILV, which supports viewpoint diversity, counters radical ideologies in the Jewish community, and opposes novel forms of anti-Semitism, which they say has emerged from radical social justice ideology. David has also served in the past as president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is a national umbrella group for local Jewish advocacy. He's also served as the executive director of the David Project, which has educated and trained college and high school students in pro-Israel advocacy, and has also held senior roles with the American Jewish Committee. So if you weren't already familiar with him, this is someone who is deeply embedded and involved in American politics and Jewish communal politics and advocacy. So David, thank you so much for taking the time to join us from America and for speaking to the JTV audience and for telling us about your new book. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be with you.
So let's jump right into this. I'm sure we'll pick up on your biography and things you've done up to now and how that informs this latest book, but let's just talk specifically about this book, which is coming out, and which we'll put a link in the video description for people to buy. You can get it from Amazon if you want to. It looks really fascinating. Tell our audience, why did you write this book?
Well, I had seen really over the course of 20 some years, an ideology that was once on the margins of society and academia and the like come to the forefront of America and really become a dominant discourse in institutions in a matter of a couple of years. So, even back in my university days in, let's say, the late 1980s, there were traces of this ideology. You might have called it political correctness in those days. But, and it was a marginal phenomena that you could pick up if you were in certain institutions, certainly if you were at the university. But over time, it became really the dominant ideology, so much so that many institutions in the United States have sort of officially adopted it in their diversity, equity, inclusion trainings and how they think about social problems, and insisting really that everybody sing from the same song sheet. And I watched that also happen in the Jewish community. It was also very clear to me, going back even to, let's say, 2002, and I wrote about this then as a professional in the Jewish world, that this ideology had the potential to spawn anti-Semitism, a variant of anti-Semitism. When you say that racism is not just about having negative attitudes about another race, but rather racism equals prejudice plus power, and you mean by power any group that is part of the white dominant class, you can easily see how that would morph into something quite problematic, that it could easily be, well, Jews are powerful, so therefore they can't be victims of racism or anti-Semitism, or that minority groups can't be victimizers because they don't have power. And you can imagine how that would create a new kind of anti-Semitism. And I think that's exactly what's happened. And we can talk more about that. I mean, in some basic way, what we saw was an oppressor versus oppressed binary that had been making its way through our discourse become really the dominant way a lot of institutions are thinking about these issues now, and really forcing it down everybody else's throats.
And tell us, because you're someone that's been really involved with progressive politics, center-left politics in America. What was the scene like? When did this start to happen? What do you think were the forces and voices and ideas that led to this shift and rise in this woke view of seeing the world and dividing people up into oppressed versus oppressors? And what was the scene? Help for people that weren't so, have a short memory or maybe are quite young. What did the scene used to be like in center-left politics?
Okay, I'm going to start with really quickly around 1968 when a group of philosophers and thinkers and others took Foucault's work and spoke of the long march through institutions, where they were going to really push this ideology that had been brewing. It was a form of Marxism in American society. Some people have called it cultural Marxism because it's not really based on class. It's based on culture and ethnicity and race.
Just sorry to interrupt. There's people that say that talking about cultural Marxism is a form of anti-Semitism.
Right, there are people who say all kinds of things, and that's obviously foolish. I want to fast forward to 2010 for a second. I had become executive director of the David Project, which is an Israel education and advocacy program for college and high school students. And I went on a tour of college campuses, and I came back feeling that the dominant way of thinking about things on campuses among the student body at that point was what I would have called soft postmodernism. It basically said that every group has its own story, its own narrative, and we should understand them on their own terms, and we shouldn't really judge. So Palestinians have their narrative, Israelis have their narratives, Brits have theirs, Americans have theirs, and each subgroup has their own. And
Al Qaeda has theirs.
What's that?
Al Qaeda has theirs.
Exactly. Well, that's where it obviously becomes immediately problematic, but never mind. We could work with it. So we trained Jewish student activists to tell their own stories more effectively, to learn how to relate to others. It was no longer about winning an argument because no one wanted to really argue in those days. They just wanted to talk about each other's stories and respect each other. So it might have been a little bit empty-headed in a way, but it didn't matter. That was the predominant paradigm on campus. A few years later, we came back after a summer and realized that almost everything had shifted practically overnight. That students were no longer thinking in terms of respecting each other's narratives, but rather started to adopt this oppressor versus oppressed binary. That coincided with the Ferguson Black Lives Matter eruption in 2013, 2014. And that became the dominant way of understanding what was happening in American society. Quickly, students have begun to adopt that and apply it to all sorts of things. They also started to adopt the language of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term that I first came across in 2015, and I wrote about it my first day on the job at Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Intersectionality holds that one has multiple identities and that those identities can overlap in such a way to give you added disadvantage or added privilege. So if you're both Black and female, you're likely to express compound oppression in a way that you wouldn't if you were only just either Black or female. That also became a clarion call for oppressed groups to sort of connect their causes. So you started to see some strange coalitions emerge, like between women who are fighting sex violence and Black Lives Matter, and of course, then the Palestinian cause. So we started to see this take shape and we're concerned about it. But still, it was still a relatively marginal phenomenon. It started to build up. And by the time George Floyd was killed in the summer of 2020, you could see it and feel it everywhere. Many institutions that are sort of putting off officially adopting it, and the racial reckoning that followed immediately signed on the dotted line and began accepting this and promulgating it, insisting everybody in their community and their organization at their workplace accept it. And that's really where things went off the rails. I mean, people stopped listening, they stopped discussing topics. They insisted that there was only really one right way to look at the world. But the problem with that, in addition to being it highly illiberal in the sense that it stifled discourse, was that it also pushed out this idea of privilege, that either you had privilege based on an identity, or you were oppressed based on that identity. And you can easily see how Jews who are on average doing better than other communities would be viewed as privileged, and they were being viewed as privileged. And things like Jewish privilege trended on Twitter. It also manifests in other ways as well. There's this concept of equity that is sort of set into the discourse. It comes from Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was adopted by a massive number of organizations. You even saw it in Jewish organizations where they started having book clubs around how to be an anti-racist, as well as Robin DiAngelo's text, White Fragility. It became very popular almost overnight. People were having these book discussion groups, and they were treating them more like Bibles than they were books. And that really concerned me. The problem with his concept of equity is it holds explicitly that any group that operates below the mean on anything, it could be, let's say, on average educational achievement or income or whatever, is necessarily oppressed. But that also means that any group that operates above the mean is complicit in oppression. And that's really problematic for the Jewish community. Another key aspect of this, of course, in this oppressor binary, is it automatically associates Israel with the oppressor class. There are people who want to try to portray Israel as being the oppressed in a much larger Arab world, but it just doesn't have any resonance, and it's not going to have any resonance. They look at Israel as the powerful party. They look at Palestinians or Hamas or whoever else as being the weak party. And therefore, by virtue of their power, not their moral case, but by their power or their perceived power, that party is the guilty party. That's the discourse that we've sort of stumbled upon in American society, and I think in UK to a lesser degree, certainly in Canada, maybe even to a greater degree. And that's going to spawn a new variant of anti-Semitism, and we're already seeing it.
Wow. And just before we talk more about what's happening at the moment, just as I was trying to sort of ask beforehand, like, what was the progressive centre-left mindset that was dominant before this became the main way of seeing the world? Like, what was just map that out for us.
Sure. So when I was growing up as an American Jewish liberal, liberalism wasn't a theory that purported to explain how the world worked. It was just a sensibility that there were people who were suffering, there were people who had less than I did, and therefore I and the larger society had some obligation to alleviate their suffering or their misfortune. But I didn't pretend to know why there was suffering. I just knew that there was suffering. And so I advocated certain policies to alleviate those economic conditions or what have you. Ironically, by the way, when I was in college and I would meet friends from the UK or South Africa or whatever, I started to understand that they actually had bought into what I would call post-colonial ideology, or their friends bought into post-colonial ideology, which purported to explain why certain countries were doing better than other countries. And it was based, at least in part, on the guilt that they felt because their countries had been part of the colonial dominant class, and so they had bought into this to a degree, but that was not something you saw a lot of in America. I mean, it was around, but it wasn't a dominant discourse. What you really saw happen was a shift in that all of a sudden, people who at one time didn't really have a strong theory of why there were differences in the world or why there was disparity among groups, all of a sudden had a theory, and it was not only did they have a theory, but they asserted it as an absolute dogma. It was a totalizing ideology, and that's where we went off the track.
Yeah. This is really fascinating. Do you think that the anti-Semitism that results from characterizing Jews as by and large privileged and therefore complicit, do you think that can be, you could attempt to address that anti-Semitism on those terms, on their terms, on the terms of that woke divide, or do you think you first need to dismantle the entire woke worldview? And by the way, I'm not necessarily saying that by talking on their terms you would necessarily be agreeing to it, but I'm just wondering whether it could be at least challenged.
Yeah, that's what I would have said 3 years ago. I no longer believe that that's the case. I don't, first of all, I worry that it's the fundamental ideology, it's the framework itself that gives rise to anti-Semitism. So if you buy into the framework and you accept that that's the framework moving forward, you're playing an ongoing game of whack-a-mole with anti-Semitism, because the very oppressed oppressor binary gives rise to this kind of anti-Semitism. A lot of Jewish groups have instinctively want to try to do what you were suggesting. They might say, well, you're saying that we're white, but we're not really white, or you're saying we're not oppressed, but we really are oppressed because we suffered in the Holocaust, um, or you're saying that we're privileged, but we're really not that privileged because there are other groups that are more privileged than we are. Again, it's you enter into the oppression Olympics and you lose. And I think that's the problem. And many of us have tried to make peace with it. And I understand why, by the way. If you were invited, if a Jewish organization was invited to participate in an anti-hate summit in a city, and they had to sign a statement which held that America is a pervasively white supremacist country and continues to oppress marginalized people, that's the price of admission. And you might say to yourself, well, if I'm not at the table, then I'm lunch. But the problem with that is you sign on to that statement, you participate there, you have a voice. They now mention that anti-Semitism is one of the protected isms among the various forms of racism that they named in that statement. And you think you've won a victory, but what you've really done is just reinforce that ideology, which is going to continue to produce anti-Semitism. That's the Jewish dilemma in today's ideology. It also more fundamentally makes America or Western societies like the UK or Canada more illiberal. It undercuts the fundamental conditions in society in which we thrive. And I don't want that. When you sign up for an ideology like that, it fans the flames of also right-wing extremism. If you're going to claim that everybody who disagrees with you is racist, or you're going to claim that everybody who doesn't have marginalized status is an oppressor, you're going to alienate an awful lot of people. And those people are going to take up ideologies on the right that may be even more dangerous than woke ideology on the left. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in America today.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's such a great irony, isn't there, that an ideology, this woke ideology, which claims to, be standing up for the oppressed and minorities, is creating a paradigm that can lead to to being prejudiced against entire groups of people, including the Jewish. There's a great irony to that, and I find it so ironic that for thousands of years the Jewish people have tried to make the world realize the importance for standing up for victim groups and the oppressed, and not to be prejudiced. And as the world's starting to get that message, they find a way. Some people find a way to use that to target Jews. The whole thing of sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, a writer, Wesley Yang, calls this the successor ideology. Look, it's okay to make claims about oppression. You may think a group is more oppressed than I do. I may think a group is more oppressed than you do. We may assess anti-Semitism differently. We may assess racism differently. What this ideology does is it tries to shut down the conversation. Some have called it epistemic closure. It's meant to say, we have the answer, we can see it. The idea of woke is that we can see these hidden systems of oppression, and therefore we get to define them because we have the lived experience to do so. I'm oppressed, so therefore I can see things that you can't see, and as a result, I get to articulate those in my experience for the rest of society. And that can become highly illiberal. It actually shuts down the ability to have conversations. And whenever you do that, you're going to see all kinds of problems emerge. You're going to see people using it to cancel other people. And that's just an invitation to anti-Semitism as well, and kind of racism too, that insists that there's only one way Black people, for example, can understand the world. Like, just because they're oppressed, therefore they have to toe some official party line. I mean, that's not a way. Like, Black people are just as ideologically diverse as anybody else, and you're telling them how they must look at the world. That's also problematic.
Yeah, And what's crazy is you, as someone who's on the progressive side of politics, centre left, you'll probably be shunned by some of these people as some kind of crazy right winger, fascist, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, even friends and former friends all of a sudden start using the worst sort of language. And I realize these debates that I'm having over this are not like the previous debates that I've ever had. You might disagree on a policy issue, right? And you could say, well, I think that there should be abortion should be legal up until 3 months, or I think it should be legal always. And you'd have this debate about that, and people could sort of do it respectfully. But all of a sudden, I realized that people were talking to me differently. It was always snark or sarcasm or just plain disgust. And you realize you were in a very different kind of discourse where the people felt like you were a heretic for challenging their understanding of the world in this way.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's really regressive. Um, it's fascinating as well, the whole paradigm of, well, privileged groups are complicit and they are in no risk of oppression. When, if you think about it, Jewish people were also, at least in Germany, not going to say throughout all of Europe, they were disproportionately successful in Germany, and yet a Holocaust happened there. So it's such poor logic. It's a fallacy to say that just because some group is doing well, that means there's no risk and they're complicit and all the rest of it.
Absolutely. And they don't see or refuse to see Jewish vulnerability. In some ways, the Jewish conditions challenges their very paradigm, because we're not obviously oppressed in the sense that we are below the mean on economic and educational achievement, but we're also vulnerable to hate crimes. So in fact, the Jewish community has been the recipient of more hate crimes, unfortunately, than every other religious community combined in America. So they don't know how to make sense of it. And as a result, they try to put us in one box or the other. And a lot of Jewish organizations, unfortunately, have bought into this ideology. There are major Jewish denominations, for example, that train their clergy and train their professionals and their congregants to disrupt daily acts of whiteness and to shed their whiteness and to become an ally in the sense that they're going to fight the system of whiteness and white supremacy that dominates America. I mean, that's language that comes right out of their trainings. It's not like I'm making that up or exaggerating. I'm not at all. I could read it for you. That's what they're doing. And when you, in addition to reinforcing the anti-Semitism that emerges out of that, you're also sort of assaulting Jewish pride as well. I don't see how a group of young people are going to feel very much kinship to the Jewish community if they feel that they're complicit in white supremacy. And that's really what we're teaching Jewish kids, that they're complicit in white supremacy. Now, look, I don't mind my kids. I have a 17-year-old, I have an 18-year-old stepson, a 20-year-old stepdaughter, a 25-year-old son. I don't mind them being exposed to these ideas. But the fact is that they're never just exposed to them. They're being told that this is the one and only way of seeing the world. If you want to teach them to also understand the other perspective, the challenge to that perspective, I'm all in. But that's not how it's being done. That's why it's an ideology.
Absolutely. And we were speaking a bit about tackling this. You said there's no point trying to speak on their terms of their worldview because it's a never-ending hole you go into. But do you think that you mentioned you challenge in some ways this notion of Jewish privilege? Do you think that do you think that notion should be challenged still, even though you don't want to go into that paradigm of I'm privileged, one group's privileged, one group's not privileged? And how would you make the case that it's a complex? Can you expand a bit more on how you would make the case? But also,
I think I would just say it is highly illiberal and problematic to link identity to privilege. In other words, if you're that it is a complete reductive perspective. It's not true. It's obviously not true. Not all white people are privileged. Not all Black people are oppressed. Not all Jews are rich. It just doesn't adequately describe the human condition. Blackness is not automatically a disadvantage depending on the context. Sometimes it is. Whiteness is not always an advantage depending on the context. That's what I would argue, that, and when you suggest that it has to be the case, that it's a binary, that each of these identities either is a net plus in privilege or a net minus, I think you're in very problematic territory. You create these obscene hierarchies of privilege where people are placed on some kind of privilege pyramid. It's the silliest thing you've ever seen, and it's obviously incorrect. It's obviously lacks nuance. So that's what I would say to something like that. I'm not going to sit there and argue that no, Jews really aren't always privileged. I'm going to say no group is always privileged and no group is always oppressed in American society today. Sure, we've seen oppression, and there can be oppression in American institutions for sure. So let's talk about that. But if you're going to tell me that it's an automatic because of one's race or one's gender or whatever have you, I think that that's extremely simplistic and ridiculous. That's what I would argue. And I think that that's what the Jewish community has to start arguing. The other thing we can do, by the way, is understand that some of our traditional coalition partners in the old civil rights movement no longer really are in sync with the Jewish condition. If they're going to embrace this ideology, I think Jewish organizations have to look for new partners, and there are new partners.
Do you not think
there are many groups? Yeah.
You don't find it's astounding, though, the level of blind spot that some people can have, where they are claiming to be standing up for the oppressed, and as a result can end up becoming anti-Semitic? Does it not astound you that there can be such levels of blind spots?
Yeah, I think the blind spot is based on fear. It's almost like willful blind spot, that people don't want to believe it because the implications to them are too grave. It means that they have to fundamentally rethink their positioning in American society. It means that they're going to be getting all sorts of headaches from their stakeholders who refuse to look at it another way. If you have board members and donors and others who may buy into the ideology, then you have to actually confront them now that you've decided that it's a threat. So it's interesting, by the way, that I've talked to British, Norwegian, Australian, South African YouTube programs like this. And I'm going to be visiting Canada a number of times. And I know I'm going to be speaking in America, and I have some lined up. But it's interesting that those are the hardest speaking engagements or the hardest podcasts or YouTube shows to come on, because too many Jews in America just don't want to have to deal with it. I was just in Israel for 8 days. I got back today. And I spoke to the foreign ministry and the president's office and numerous Israeli officials. They all see the problem, and they wonder what alien species has descended upon America and installed microchips in their brains. And I had no problem having these conversations with anybody there, even people who thought I might be overstating it to a degree or two, to still be involved in a conversation. We might disagree on what to do about it, but they still could have the conversation. It's incredibly difficult to do that in the United States right now. Canada less so. And the Canadian condition is very interesting because in Canada, most Jews are more sort of traditionally minded on these issues and are less likely to buy into wokeness. But Canada as a country is buying into wokeness in a frightening pace, and there's no opposing political force like there is in the United States to call it out. So the Canadian Jew on the one hand is both more likely to be aligned with me, but also more isolated politically.
Yeah. And another fascinating phenomenon is that, someone who is a huge cultural figure and has been called out massively, but, is still not backing down, but aligned himself with Trump and all that, anti-Black Lives Matter and all the rest of it, Kanye West, who has just been peddling classic anti-Semitic tropes and is clearly not in a stable place or a happy place, and is just being totally incoherent, clearly, but at the same time is saying things that are deeply anti-Semitic and hurtful and dangerous. The first thing I would note is that, interestingly enough, there's a bit of a horseshoe in politics where you have both sides end up talking about the Jewish people as a whole being overly privileged or disproportionately powerful.
Right. We're also seeing some radical Black voices combine the traditional anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes and radical social justice ideology, which tends to be more subtle. And there, you can see it in the same tweet, both varieties wrapped up in one.
Yeah, but I had two questions on this, two separate questions about the whole Kanye West thing. Number one, this idea of portraying Jews, it's been going on for many generations as some kind of a powerful elite and talking conspiratorial terms. How else do you explain people who have been so small throughout history and dispersed, yet have done so disproportionately well? I've heard some people I've spoken to in the Israel advocacy movement and others saying we should own our success and be like, yeah, we've worked really hard, and there's been, and certain religious people feel there's just a divine help, and why can't we just say that? And maybe also just like, it's our culture of education and family and hard work and all the rest of it. And they explain it that way, or do you feel we should actually just push back and say, actually, excuse me, what about all the persecution throughout history? We haven't always had it so good. There's been times when we've been disproportionately poor and sidelined. Like, this is just, which way do you tackle that?
More the former than the latter. There's nothing wrong with success. Absolutely nothing wrong with success, and some of success comes out of the culture of a community, and some of the problems in a community might come out of the culture of a community. And I think we have to own up to that. If people are so frightened to talk about culture, we're actually burying a very important variable. Now, I think culture can sometimes be used in a very ugly way. There are people who will say, well, Black people just don't want to work hard, for example. That's ugly. That's stupid. Sometimes we have to take pains to disaggregate culture, to make sure that we're not overgeneralizing about a group's culture. So, for example, there are anti-Semitic problems in the Black community, anti-Asian sentiment in the Black community in New York that are leading to violence. That doesn't mean it's happening everywhere, and that Black people share this culture of antipathy toward Jews and Asians. They don't. It's just happening at a very particular pace, but it is a culture in that place. So I think we have to be willing to talk about culture in a way, because it's a variable and why there's disparity. And if we're not willing to talk about it, we're not actually fixing the right problem in some cases. And it's not mutually exclusive. It doesn't mean that there aren't structures and systems that are problematic, that are still leading to oppression. But we have to have that conversation in an open way, in a thoughtful way, in a liberal way. And that's what we're really lacking today.
Absolutely. And we're talking all about anti-Semitism on the elements of the progressive side. Are you concerned with, Kanye West will have a lot of people who, both listen to him, even despite all the backlash he's had, and he's someone that's aligned himself with, in the past with Trump and with things more associated with conservative and right-wing circles. Are you concerned about a rise of more classical, old-school anti-Semitism on the right?
Well, it's already happening, not necessarily because of Kanye, but because you have this replacement theory idea that's gained ground on the American right. It's this idea that ordinary Americans are being replaced by immigrants. And in the racist anti-Semitic imagination, Jews play a very key role in ushering in these immigrants and creating the social and political conditions. So when the murderer of the 11 Jews in Squirrel Hill, Pennsylvania, shot up that synagogue, he was desperate, he said, to prevent Jews from bringing in more immigrants to replace Americans. So you can see there is an ideology on the right as well, and Kanye can tap into some of those tropes. The fact that he has 31 million followers, I think on Twitter or Instagram or both, tells me that we have a problem, even if normally we would ignore somebody who's got such delusions. I think that, we have a problem on the right. I can tell you, for example, when I posted about my book on several anti-critical race theory Facebook sites, because I figured those are people who might actually buy my book, why not? And every single case, one or two people would say, you Jews should stop whining about wokeness because you created it in the first place, which was a reminder to me of the right-wing anti-Semitism we face. Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL talks about right-wing anti-Semitism like it's a hurricane and left-wing anti-Semitism like it's climate change. The problem is he leaves out a critical aspect of it, and that is that he doesn't talk about what the CO2 emissions are on the left that are producing the climate change on the left. In other words, when we talk about right-wing anti-Semitism, it is not controversial to talk about the role that replacement theory plays in exacerbating anti-Semitism. When we talk about anti-Semitism in the Muslim world, it is not really that controversial to talk about the role that Islamism and jihadi ideology play in that, and the role of the infidel and the like. But when we talk about left-wing anti-Semitism, it's as if we're talking about a symptom without a cause. We don't actually talk about what it is that's fanning the flames of it. And I think we need to connect the dots for people. They need to connect the dots for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Are we witnessing the decline of the West?
I don't know. I worry about that. I'm an optimist by nature, so it's hard for me to say that, that America or the West can't stand up for its Enlightenment values. But they're certainly in duress. And it may be just like, at one point in the 20th century when the West was in trouble and sort of regained its footing, during industrialization, that we'll regain our footing. But right now we're in this vicious cycle where the left is making the right crazier and the right is making the left crazier, where we've lost faith in our institutions, and our institutions really haven't stood up for their traditional values very well. And we're in a state of role enemy and flux, and it's very disconcerting. And I'm not sure that I can say with certainty that the West is going to come out on the positive end of this. I just don't know if we're going to be able to live up to our values. Woke ideology in particular has a way of shutting down liberalism. When people call you a racist, or when they call you an oppressor, or they call certain views, they associate certain views as being oppressive, traditional liberals just don't want to fight back. The price of fighting back is too high, so they sort of sacrifice their ideals. There's that old saying, never wrestle with a pig because you'll get dirty and the pig will like it. And the problem is when you don't do that for long enough, the pig wins. And I think that's what we've seen.
Do you still feel comfortable as a Jew in the Democratic Party?
Look, the Democratic Party, it's a matter of alternative, right? If there were a third party, maybe I'd vote for that party. And maybe in certain instances, I'll vote for the Republican if I think the person is, a moderate or the better candidate. But the Republican Party has also gotten more extreme. In some ways, the Republican Party has become more dominated by ideology than the Democratic Party. What we're seeing in wokeness is not full capture of the Democratic Party. It's there, but it's not the dominating force. What we're seeing in wokeness is the domination of institutions.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one thing that I've has noticed happening on both sides of the political debate in America, it's just that polarization is becoming more and more extreme. The ability to have any kind of nuance or accept legitimacy to your opponents. It's like both sides, and it's like both sides believe they're at war now, and therefore the rules have changed. The
rules have changed. They'll use phrases, especially on the left. They'll say, "Oh, you're doing tone policing," as if that's some high crime.
What do you call it? I'm not doing tone policing.
What's that?
What did you say? Tone policing.
Yeah, they're saying tone policing. So if I say, why are you calling that person an asshole and not debating the point he was raising? And they'll say, you're tone policing me here. Say, no, I'm not. I'm accusing you of not actually engaging in a discussion of ideas. But that's what they do. What's happening now is that people have sort of taken off the gloves. They feel like they can say whatever they want to whomever they want. They can engage in personal ad hominem, and that they have no responsibility to sort of uphold the discourse. And then they accuse me of being illiberal if I call them out on being extremely uncivil to the point that they can't even have a conversation.
Yeah. Well, in that light and in that spirit, let's be nuanced here. Do you feel that there is any valuable insights that the woke paradigm provides for us and has given us?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Yes, absolutely. Look, I engage in systems thinking all the time now. Doesn't mean I buy it hook, line, and sinker. So if you're asking me, are certain systems themselves corrupted by oppression or bias? Yeah, I think that there are. And so I've learned from critical thinking how to look at systems problems and not just prejudice as an individual issue. I think it's also true that lived experience can help us understand certain problems. I'm Jewish. I've experienced anti-Semitism. you should hear me out at least on it, right? Doesn't mean that I get to define it for you once and for all, that you have to accept everything I say, but at least you should hear me out. So I think both those propositions that make up wokeness, that bias and oppression are embedded in systems, can be true, and that lived experience can help one understand the world in a way that you might not be able to see if you don't have it, can be true too. But they're not the whole thing, and they shouldn't be used to shut down discussion and weaponized in the way they have. That's where we go off the rails.
David, I have to say, you are one of my favorite guests we've had on JTV. You are, it's so incredibly, it sounds like you have given this such great thought. You're incredibly thought out and articulate about these issues and nuanced, whilst at the same time providing the kind of moral clarity that I feel is so needed. I wonder if you could, in my final question, you could share with us just some tips you would give our audience and viewers, and perhaps some things that are shared in the book about ways in which we can fight these things that we've been discussing.
Sure. So number one, we have to bring more people out of the woodwork. There are a lot of people who agree that this ideology is a problem. They don't like it. They ignore it, but they can't ignore it for that long. It's going to catch up with them. And I think it's very important that we help them find the courage of their convictions. That's really important. Two, we need more activists, people who are not just going to speak out, but are going to organize others in speaking out and engaging in advocacy around these issues. There's an emerging field, but we need more of it. Third, we need to find new friends, particularly in the Jewish community. There are all kinds of groups in the US, and I'm sure the same is true in Canada and the UK and Australia, who don't like this ideology. Asian Americans who face some of the same problems that Jews face in this ideological format. Those are people that we can make common cause with. As with Black heterodox thinkers who don't want their kids to be taught that the system is rigged against them and that they have no agency. Again, those are our friends. Let's find them. Let's work with them. So those are some of the things that I think are really important that we do. We have to challenge our institutions. You know, in a Jewish day school, for example, that's teaching its kids that they're complicit in white supremacy. You know, you may not be able to feel comfortable doing it alone. Find five friends who you can work with, and you can go meet with the headmaster and discuss the problem with. And there's strength in numbers here as well. So that's what I would do to start turning it around. I think we are turning it around to a degree. There's more space to challenge it than there was 2 years ago, but we've got a long way to go because some of our institutions are just so far down the rabbit hole.
I think you hit the nail on the head there with getting your friends and peers involved. Part of the problem is that they try to, when people attack anyone that stands up against the woke view, they try and say that it's you're being prejudiced, you're being unethical, and people are scared to come out against this. There's a lack of courage.
There's a lack of courage, and there's a lack of vocabulary. It took me a while to develop this sort of the antidote to this, to develop the vocabulary to oppose it. And we've got to spend time in the same way that these ideological forces have over many years of developing our messaging, developing our arguments, so that people have it at their fingertips and that they can then respond effectively. Because right now, a lot of people know what's wrong, but they don't know what to say.
Yeah, and do you inform people of those arguments in your book?
I do. I have a whole section on that. The last 3 chapters are really devoted to what do we do about it. I also, on the website, Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, JILV.org, we have an FAQ, a frequently asked questions section. And we also have a glossary of woke terms that I commend to people, and so that they can understand what they're dealing with. And I'm always happy to talk to people who might have questions or issues or want to talk through a problem. That's part of what we do.
Brilliant. Well, David, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to my cousin Eitan Anisfeld for making me aware of your work and your book and everything. And so thank you to him for helping initiate this interview. Appreciate having you on, and would love to have you back on again because it's been really insightful.
Just tell me when.
I will do. Thank you so much, David.
Take care.
Appreciate it.